Everyone in your life has an opinion on this. Your parents will tell you buying a home is the smartest financial decision you'll ever make. Financial influencers will tell you renting is throwing your money away. And somewhere in the middle, you're left wondering who's actually right. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Almost nobody doing this comparison is actually doing the math correctly. Because the real comparison between renting and buying isn't about which one feels more responsible or which one your family approves of. It's about opportunity cost, hidden expenses, and a set of assumptions that most people never actually check. So today, we're going to walk through the real math, the numbers nobody shows you, and why the answer might completely surprise you depending on where you live and what year it actually is. Let's start with the phrase that's been drilled into almost every American's head since childhood. Rent is throwing money away. It sounds intuitive. You pay rent every month, and at the end of the year, you have nothing to show for it. No equity, no asset, nothing. Meanwhile, if you buy a home, every mortgage payment builds equity, and eventually, you own something real. This sounds airtight on the surface, but this comparison leaves out almost everything that actually matters financially. Because buying a home isn't free money building equity in a vacuum. It comes with an enormous list of costs that rarely get mentioned in the same breath as the phrase building equity. To understand why, we need to rewind to where this belief even came from. Because the idea that homeownership is the ultimate financial goal isn't some timeless economic truth. It's largely a product of policy decisions made in the mid-20th century. After World War II, the US government actively pushed homeownership through programs like the GI Bill and FHA-backed loans, specifically to stimulate the economy and stabilize the middle class. Suburbs exploded, mortgage interest became tax-deductible, and an entire cultural narrative formed around the idea that a house with a white picket fence represented success. And for decades, this narrative held up reasonably well because home prices grew steadily, interest rates were manageable, and incomes kept pace with housing costs. But the world today looks completely different from the world that built that narrative, and the math has changed dramatically, even if the cultural belief hasn't caught up yet. So let's actually build out the real comparison, starting with what buying a home actually costs beyond just the mortgage payment. Because when people compare rent to a mortgage payment, they're comparing the wrong two numbers entirely. Meet Emma. Emma is deciding between renting an apartment for $2,200 a month or buying a home for $450,000. At a 7% interest rate with 20% down, Emma's monthly mortgage payment on the remaining $360,000 comes out to roughly $2,395. At first glance, that looks pretty close to her rent. Only $200 more a month for the pride of ownership. Case closed, right? Except Emma's mortgage payment is nowhere close to her actual monthly cost of owning that home. Because on top of the mortgage, Emma now has to pay property taxes, which in most parts of the country run between 1% and 2% of the home's value annually. On a $450,000 home, that's somewhere between $375 and $750 a month, just in property taxes. Then there's homeowner's insurance, which averages somewhere around $150 to $250 a month depending on the region, and has been rising sharply in recent years due to climate-related risk in many parts of the country. Then there's private mortgage insurance, or PMI, which kicks in if you put down less than 20%, adding potentially hundreds more a month. And then there's maintenance. The widely used rule of thumb among real estate professionals is that homeowners should budget roughly 1% of the home's value per year for maintenance and repairs. On a $450,000 home, that's $4,500 a year, or $375 a month. And that's before anything unexpected happens, like a roof replacement, a broken furnace, or a failing water heater. So let's actually add this up for Emma. Mortgage payment of $2,395, plus property taxes around $560, plus insurance around $300, plus maintenance around $375. That brings Emma's real monthly cost of ownership to roughly $3,530 a month, not $2,395. Suddenly, the comparison to her $2,200 rent doesn't look close at all. It looks like Emma would be paying over $1,300 more per month to own instead of rent. And this is the exact gap that almost never gets mentioned when people casually compare a mortgage payment to a rent payment, as if those two numbers represent the same thing. But the story doesn't stop there, because now we have to talk about the part of this comparison that almost nobody does correctly, which is opportunity cost. Because Emma isn't just choosing between two monthly payments. She's also choosing what happens to the money she isn't spending if she rents instead of buys. If Emma rents, she keeps her $90,000 down payment instead of putting it into a house. And she also has an extra $1,300 a month that she isn't spending on the gap between renting and owning. If Emma takes that $90,000 and invests it in a diversified stock index fund, and if we use a conservative long-term average return of around 7% annually after inflation, that $90,000 alone would grow to roughly $175,000 over 10 years without Emma adding another dollar to it. And if she also invests that extra $1,300 a month gap into the same index fund, that adds tens of thousands more in growth over the same period. This is the piece of the puzzle that the phrase rent is throwing money away completely ignores. Because buying a home isn't just building equity, it's also giving up the opportunity to invest that capital somewhere else. And historically, the stock market has significantly outperformed real estate appreciation over long periods of time. According to long-term data, U.S. home prices have appreciated at an average of roughly 3 to 4% annually over the past several decades, while the S&P 500 has averaged closer to 10% annually before inflation, or around 7% after inflation. That gap compounds dramatically over 10, 20, or 30 years. Now, before you assume this means renting always wins, it's important to say clearly that this isn't universally true, and the math shifts enormously based on a few key variables. The first variable is how long you plan to stay in the home. Buying a home comes with enormous transaction costs. Closing costs when buying typically run 2 to 5% of the purchase price. And when you eventually sell, real estate agent commissions typically eat up another 5 to 6% of the sale price. On Emma's $450,000 home, that's potentially over $40,000 in transaction costs alone across buying and selling. If Emma only stays in the home for 2 or 3 years, these transaction costs alone could wipe out any equity gains entirely, making renting the clear financial winner in the short term almost every single time. But if Emma stays in that home for 15 or 20 years, the math starts shifting significantly because her mortgage payment stays relatively fixed while rent, historically, tends to rise over time with inflation. So the longer someone stays in a home, the more that fixed mortgage payment becomes an advantage compared to a rising rent payment, and the more time equity has to build. This is why real estate professionals often say the break-even point for buying versus renting is usually somewhere between 5 and 7 years, though this varies enormously by local market conditions. Here's real estate economist and author Karl Case's core insight on this topic, someone whose work laid the foundation for the widely used Case-Shiller Home Price Index. Housing is a consumption good and an investment good at the same time, and people often confuse the two, treating a place to live as if it were purely a wealth-building vehicle, when a huge portion of what you're actually paying for is simply shelter, not investment return. And this brings us to the second major variable, which is what's happening with interest rates and local home prices at the specific moment someone is making this decision, because the math looks completely different depending on the environment. In 2021, when mortgage rates were sitting around 3%, buying was financially much more competitive with renting in a lot of markets because the monthly cost of a mortgage on a given home price was dramatically lower than it is today. But by 2023 through 2026, mortgage rates rose sharply into the high 6 and 7% range, while home prices in most markets never actually corrected downward to compensate. This created what's often called an affordability squeeze, where both the price of homes and the cost of borrowing to buy them are elevated simultaneously, something that historically doesn't happen very often. And it's part of why renting has become financially more competitive in a lot of major U.S. metro areas over the past few years compared to historical norms. A quick pause, because this video is sponsored by Gamma. When I'm building out a comparison like this, pulling data from Case-Shiller indices, Bureau of Labor Statistics rent data, and mortgage rate history, it's an enormous amount of information to organize clearly. Gamma is what turns that into something presentable. I upload my research through Claude, connect the Gamma integration, and it builds a clean, structured deck automatically. When I find new data, it updates instead of me rebuilding from scratch. It also connects to GitHub, Notion, and Gmail, so nothing stays trapped as scattered notes. If you want to check it out, head to gamma.app or find it inside Claude connectors. Thanks again to Gamma for sponsoring this video. Now back to the real math, because there's a third variable that gets almost no attention in this debate, and it's arguably one of the most important. It's what economists call imputed rent, or more simply, the psychological and lifestyle value of owning versus renting that doesn't show up on a spreadsheet at all. Because owning a home gives you stability, control over your space, the ability to renovate, and freedom from a landlord potentially raising your rent or not renewing your lease. Renting gives you flexibility, the ability to relocate easily for a job, and freedom from the responsibility of unexpected repairs and maintenance. These aren't financial variables exactly, but they absolutely factor into real decisions, and pretending this is a purely mathematical choice ignores the fact that housing decisions are also deeply personal and circumstantial. But even acknowledging that, it's worth being honest about a specific dynamic that's happened in the housing market over the last several years, because it's the part that traditional financial media tends to gloss over. Since 2020, U.S. home prices have risen by more than 40% in many markets, while wage growth over that same period has risen by roughly half that amount. This has created one of the widest affordability gaps between income and home prices in modern U.S. history. According to widely cited housing affordability data, the median U.S. home price relative to median household income is now near record highs, historically comparable to levels seen right before the 2008 housing crash, though for very different underlying reasons this time, driven more by supply shortages and elevated interest rates than by predatory lending practices. And this affordability gap changes the entire renting versus buying conversation for an enormous portion of the population. Because for many younger buyers today, it's not actually a choice between renting and buying based on which one makes more financial sense. It's increasingly a situation where buying simply isn't accessible in the first place, regardless of preference, because the down payment and monthly payment required have outpaced what a median income household can realistically qualify for in a lot of major metro areas, which means renting isn't always a financial strategy chosen after comparing the numbers. For a growing number of people, it's the only mathematically available option, whether or not homeownership would have been the better long-term financial decision in an ideal world. So where does this actually leave the real math? If you're comparing renting versus buying, the honest answer is that it depends heavily on how long you plan to stay in the home, what mortgage rates and home prices look like in your specific market right now, and what you would realistically do with the money you'd save by renting instead. If you're someone who would actually invest the difference consistently into a diversified portfolio, renting can very realistically outperform buying financially over shorter to medium time horizons, especially in markets with historically high price-to-rent ratios. But if you're someone who wouldn't consistently invest that difference and would instead simply spend it, then the forced savings mechanism of a mortgage payment building equity over time can end up being the better real-world outcome, even if it's not the theoretically optimal one on a spreadsheet. And this is exactly why the real math on this topic gets flattened into an oversimplified slogan on social media, because the actual answer is nuanced, personal, and dependent on assumptions that change from person to person and market to market. It's not a clickable, universally true statement, and that's precisely why influencers on both sides of this debate tend to present it as if it were one. The rent is throwing money away, crowd ignores opportunity cost, transaction costs, and the true all-in cost of ownership. And the renting is always smarter. Crowd tends to ignore the forced savings discipline of a mortgage, the value of housing stability, and the fact that not everyone will actually invest the difference they save by renting. So here's the actual question worth asking, instead of which option is universally better. If you ran the full comparison, including property taxes, insurance, maintenance, transaction costs, and the opportunity cost of your down payment invested elsewhere, would buying still make sense for how long you actually plan to stay in that specific home, in that specific market, at today's specific interest rate? Because when you run those real numbers, instead of relying on a slogan you heard from a relative or a 15-second video online, the answer is rarely as obvious as either side of this debate wants you to believe. That's why I made this channel, because the financial decisions that matter most in people's lives rarely come with a clean, universal answer. They come with a spreadsheet full of assumptions that most people never actually build out for themselves. So if you want to understand the real math behind the biggest financial decisions you'll ever make, hit subscribe. Because the next widely repeated financial slogan probably falls apart the same way this one does, the moment you actually run the numbers.